Welcome. This is Aaron Wissner from Local Future, and I'm here with Nicole Foss, live from New Zealand. Nicole, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
And today we are talking about the future of a cashless society and the good, the bad, and the ugly. I don't know, have you seen that film, Nicole?
I think I fell asleep partway through, but I've seen some of it.
That wouldn't be surprising. It's a very, very long film. Welcome to everybody who is joining us on Zoom and also on YouTube. Introductions. My name is Aaron Wissner. I am a community educator, I guess you could call me. I taught public school for over 25 years, and now my mission is just to help people understand what's going on in the world. And Nicole, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm a big picture person. So my formal background is in biology and law, but I've done a whole lot of other things as well. So I was a research fellow in oil and gas, and so I ran the agri-energy producing station in Ontario. So I'd written for quite a while for a site called the Oil Drum. Then my writing partner and I set up the Automatic Earth so that we could write on not just energy, but also energy and finance for 20 years at that point as well. And we set up our own site, ran that for some 10 years. And now my work is at applied systems thinking. And the idea is to pull together all the different threads of things and integrate them into the biggest possible big picture.
And I'd like to thank everybody who's joining us. There's several people from the United States online right now, but I know this channel is often watched by people from Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Ireland, Brussels, and many other places, Canada, not just the English-speaking world, but around. So thank you so much for joining us, either live or over YouTube later on. Reminders, if you are on here, if you could please like, if you're on YouTube, and put a little comment in, and make sure to subscribe and sign up for notifications, and then share this. If you found this in any way useful, go ahead and share this. Oh, and one reminder I often forget, if you're watching later than we recorded this, remember you can turn up the speed to like double speed or 1.5 speed. I find that doing that, you can usually get about 99% of what the people are saying and get through it in half of the time. So since we're shooting for about 2 hours today, if you want to put it on double speed, shrink it down to an hour, I think you might enjoy that. Give it a try. You get used to it after a while, which is what I have found. So let's take a look at just a little bit as far as where we're starting from. This whole idea about a cashless society, it's already quite popular in Sweden. They've been trying to do this for a while. Unfortunately, there are some issues with what happens if cash disappears. What if there's a war or the electricity grid is down? So how do you get through if you're on a cashless society? They have this pamphlet in Sweden, which is called If War Comes, or When War Comes. And one of the things it lists for something you will need is cash in small denominations. So it seems like that would be important to have cash in your society. Now, cashless society is not a new thing. Wikipedia has a whole page on it, and there are many countries that are moving in that direction. Some are already at least 50% cashless, and some are getting closer to further along. This brings us to the topic of a digital currency, which could be created by a government or a nonprofit, or it could be community-based. So there's a lot of different choices. Bitcoin is one of the most well-known decentralized digital currencies. All of this, of course, is in contrast to a gift economy, which is basically a family where everybody shares everything they have, and people don't necessarily assert property rights over any particular thing, especially the necessities. As far as going cashless right now, because we are in May of 2020, this whole issue of the health emergency right now is going on, and whether or not paper money or currency should even be used in public due to the possibility of being a vector or transmitter of illness. In the United States, one of the recent news is that, oh, the Bay Bridge over the Chesapeake Bay is going to go cashless, which makes a big question on who does that impact most. And again, speeding up the move to a cashless society. These are all current articles. Should the world go cashless? Should we be focusing on these various strategies? A couple notes from my perspective. One thing I noticed that was really nice about going cashless at one time was being able to pay all my bills through one organization. So when I was part of the public school system, we had this health equity website. Anytime we were billed for any medical expenses, it would go here after going through the insurance company, and then we could just click on the ones we wanted to pay, and if we didn't want to pay some of them, we would dispute them, and it was all hooked up to a health savings account or savings account. So it seems like there could be some benefits, especially since getting paper bills in the mail is really annoying. Wouldn't it be nice to just have one place where all the bills came in, and then you could just say click, 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 pay the ones you want, and along you go. The Public Banking Institute, Ellen Brown, I'll probably be having a talk with her later this week. Her idea is that states could have their own banks, and those states would work in the interest of the public. She's not the only one. Michael Hudson is also on board with that, and many others. Steve Keen, on the other hand, he has a blog called debtdeflation.com, and he believes it's time for a debt jubilee. In other words, all the debts that are personal debts basically get written down, and this idea has been spreading in lots of newspapers about this. In fact, there's Steve Keen. I just typed in, you can see debt jubilee, and his name came up as one of the main proponents. Another person who's working on money is a fellow named Tom Greco, and he's written a book called The End of Money, The Future of Civilization, which really focuses on the idea of mutual credit or community credit within a community, also known as complementary currencies or credit clearing circles. So Michael Hudson, if you're not familiar with him yet, I think Nicole might agree. I'll let her say in a moment, but he has some great insights onto the situation we're in right now as far as the owners and how the owners have basically control of everything, and how we are basically just paying the owners, and we have become, again, the serfs. The last little note I have is that all these things, of course, have to lay on top of energy. Energy is what drives the economy, and energy through food is what keeps us alive. And so all economics has to, at some point, go back to energy. And without that, it can't really be an economic system that continues indefinitely. So great questions that we might touch on today. What is money anyway? Life and death, food, credit, future. Does it have to do with the future? Is it confidence? Is it debt? Is it faith in the future? Is it violence or theft? Or is it a form of language? What is it? And so our guest today, Nicole Foss, she has her blog, Applied Systems Thinking, foss.blog. I think I looked it up the wrong way last time. And she has a good article back from 2016 on this. And so, Nicole, let's just go to you right now. And what do you have to say about this whole idea of a cashless future?
Well, I don't think it's as good an idea as people think it is. I mean, it will be sold to people as convenient. And yes, it's true that it is convenient, but it also is going to mean giving up the last vestiges of financial privacy. And personally, I think that's a step too far. It also means giving up control over one's store of value. So if you have a store of value that's entirely electronic, someone can change the value of that at any time that they want. Well, the owner, and it can be hacked as well. So you can end up with something that was haircut officially or hacked unofficially and value removed from it. Anything that's electronic, you're in an arms race between the people who are trying to protect what's there and the people who are trying to remove it. And I don't necessarily assume that that will be won by the right people. I just think that it's not a good idea from the point of view of being able to preserve capital as liquidity. You won't necessarily have access to it when you want it. It will mean not only being able to haircut the value of the account, but also being able to determine how much access to it you can have. So capital controls can be imposed. You might be told in a crunch, well, you can only have $250 a week or a month even, maybe. And typically it won't be enough to cover people's basic expenses. So these things have happened, and it happened in Greece recently, for instance, when Greece was having all its difficulties. There were limits to what you could remove from the bank. In Argentina in 2001, it started that way with limits to what you could remove, and then you just weren't allowed to have any of it at all. So I do expect there to be problems like that. If you have something that's outside the system, then you have some means to protect yourself against the loss of value. So it's not that there's no risk if you have value outside of the system, cash that would be. So there's fire and there's flood and there's theft. There are obvious things that can happen if you have cash outside of the system. But at the same time, those are things that you are in a reasonable position to be able to manage. So you can imagine ways that you could protect yourself against fire and flood and theft, but there's nothing you can do to protect yourself against a collapse of the global banking system, because it's based on the actions of other people who've been taking risks and privatizing the gains and socializing the losses for a long time. At some point, that can hit a breaking point, and then there isn't enough in the system anymore. And those are risks that you have no control over whatsoever. So I think in times when the risks are obviously growing, you want to have your store of value in a form where you personally are in the best position to manage the risks that you're going to be facing.
Couldn't the federal government, through its Treasury Direct system, so Treasury Direct is part of the Treasury where you can buy Treasury bonds and things like that directly, and then you link it with your bank account. You can transfer money into the Treasury Direct account to buy the treasuries, but then if they mature right away, the money just stays as cash within the Treasury Direct account. Couldn't there just be a Treasury Direct account for everybody in the United States? Every adult that, I don't know, is on the census rolls, or every adult that, you know, has a postal address, or, I mean, there must be some list that they could go to and say, here's all the people that are around. Let's just make an account for each one. And you type in your social security number, you type in your name, you type in your birth date, and now everybody has access to this account. And then you can use this account like cash, and they could put in $100 a month, or $500 a month, or $2,000 a month, or whatever. But at least that would be a way to get everybody cash. What do you think of that idea?
If they can put it in, they can also take it out. So the problem is who has control. And if you have a system like that, yes, there is convenience and it reduces administrative costs and things, but it also means that if there's a banking crisis, those accounts can simply be removed. So people's money is in harm's way, is my point about that. And you may or may not be able to access it when you need it. There have been instances where costs have been simply imposed on people through accounts like that, and it just gives people more control, gives the center more control over people's accounts than I think is healthy, because there's so many incentives to abuse that control in a time of contraction, and I think it would be abused.
Are you suggesting that the United States Treasury would put money in at one point, and then some month or two later would be like, we're just going to subtract 10% from everybody's account, or something like that? Do you not have faith in the United States Treasury?
No, not at all.
No, why not?
Well, for instance, bail-ins were talked about a lot towards in the last financial crisis.
Bail-ins?
So a bail-in is where, instead of a bailout where the taxpayer simply makes everybody whole, a bail-in is where you use the depositor's funds to bail out the bank. So this is very much the sort of thing that's on the cards. Multiple jurisdictions either already have bail-in legislation or are preparing it. And this would mean that you can't count on whatever you have in the bank being accessible when push comes to shove. It could be haircut by a certain percentage, as bank accounts were in Cyprus. Maybe over a certain limit, but maybe across the board, because we don't have the rules yet, but either one of those things is possible.
Are you suggesting for people that have cash in banks in the United States or New Zealand or Australia? I mean, where are you suggesting that people are at risk here?
Well, because their money in the bank is not seen as their money. As far as the system is concerned, once you've put money in the bank, that is an unsecured loan that you have made to the bank that they may or may not return depending on their capacity to do so. People think they've put their money in the bank account. That is not the case. It's not seen as being their money. And so when you want it back, you would think that they would have no objection to giving you back your own money, but they may well. They are already in some jurisdictions saying, oh, well, we'll give you a certain amount of money, but you have to let us know what you want it for. And if you withdraw more than a certain amount of money, you get red flagged for an audit, for instance, because there's a growing suspicion over cash. The authorities are assuming that people only use cash for nefarious purposes, things like tax evasion or drug dealing or illegal activities of various kinds. There's a huge amount of suspicion over the use of cash. So if you want cash or if you have cash, then this tends to raise suspicions and you can be investigated. Even if the cash you have is yours, you legitimately earned it, you have every right to store it in whatever form you choose, but that's not the way the system sees it. The system wants your money in the cash, in the bank account, so that they have visibility over it and control over it, especially when push comes to shove. They are going to want to control the money supply, and I think every tool that they can use to do that is something that they will use.
So if someone had, for example, I don't know, $10,000 US or Canadian or 10,000 pounds or whatever, what in a bank account what would you suggest they do?
I certainly wouldn't leave all I had in a bank account. I would want to make sure that I had a certain amount under my own control, if there was any way to do that. Not everyone can do that. An awful lot of people live paycheck to paycheck and simply have no capacity to be able to do that anyway. But for people who do, so it depends what you have as to what you would want in and out of the system. You probably want to have a certain amount of your resources in the system, because it does make things a lot easier for dealing with bills and things like that. But I certainly wouldn't keep all of it in the system. Some people have no choice. They live paycheck to paycheck. They really don't have the capacity to withdraw anything, but they're not really putting a lot at risk and just leaving it there either. I think people do need a certain amount under their own control if they have the capacity to do so. Because if you do have a banking crisis, it could happen very quickly. It could basically happen all at once. And then people will be out of luck if they don't have any capacity to be able to provide for themselves. And we're talking about basic things and being able to buy food, being able to buy fuel and things like that. I think if you don't have cash on hand, then that could get very difficult. This happened during the Australian fires, for instance, last year, where they have a cashless benefit card, and people who didn't have access to the infrastructure for that were not able to buy themselves food and things. They were stranded in places where they had no access to anything. And that's a major, major risk if you try and move over to that kind.
Would you suggest something like digital currency, like a Bitcoin then? Have you looked into that at all? Is that something worth even looking into?
A lot of people would say yes. I'm not a fan of cryptocurrencies. I think they're all basically Ponzi schemes. They're all structured as Ponzi schemes, and there are more and more of them all the time. I don't see any connection to real value whatsoever. What I see is just the perfect bubble. Create something out of nothing, get people to buy into it, get more and more people to buy into it at the base all the time, so that the people at the top can benefit from an enormous increase in the valuation of their holdings. But at some point, the people at the bottom are going to end up being the empty bag holders, the people who've bought in the most recently. And the value is so volatile. So you never have any idea what your holdings are actually worth. And how can you judge what it's worth to pay for a particular thing if you don't know what the holdings you're using to pay for it will be worth next week compared to what they're worth now? I mean, if your money is suddenly worth twice as much, then you just really overpaid for the car the previous week. Or it could be worth half as much later on, and then you've made a great deal, but you don't know. And so I don't think that kind of system is anywhere near stable enough to be relied upon. There have been thefts from systems like that. People have also lost Bitcoin wallets, and there's no way to reclaim what you had if you do. There have been staggeringly large losses some of the time. It isn't a system that I would trust. I mean, I can see why bigger players would want to do that, but for small players, I don't think it makes sense. And it is unbelievably energy intensive as well. So in a world where we're going to have a problem with energy and complexity, I don't see Bitcoin being something that will survive. It's already using as much energy as some countries just to generate fictitious value. So I don't see a system like that as really having a future. I do see local currencies having a future, but not some global scale electronic version.
When I was watching Michael Hudson's talks today, I watched 3 of them this afternoon. One of the things that occurred to me is that the digital currencies and the complementary currencies, they're still claims on the future. It's just now that more people are making more claims on the future. So if there's any sort of exchange rate between these currencies and the global currencies, then it's just an increasing of the money supply. And perhaps at this moment, I can see 2 things. Number one, if there's a great deal of deflation, then yes, I can see there'd be a good idea to do community currencies locally to make sure that people can, buy and sell stuff in a community. But on the other hand, if it swings around to more of a inflationary or rapid inflation, then it would exacerbate the problem, really.
Well, it really is the former situation that we're looking at. We're looking at a deflation coming up. And so there's going to be much less money because we're going to see the money supply crash. The vast majority of the money is credit. And when people cease to believe in the value of human promises, that value disappears. So we are going to end up crashing the money supply. And then when there's not a lot of money around, people will hang on to every penny because they don't know when they're going to get their next paycheck, which means the velocity of money falls a very long way as well. And when there's very little money in circulation.
So basically you're saying the spending really slows down. That's what you're really talking about, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. The money stops circulating in the economy because people are not spending it. Because money doesn't disappear when you spend it. It just moves to the next person who spends it. And then they buy something from someone else and it goes round and round in the economy. And this is what you need to be able to support economic activity. If you can't do that because there's not enough money circulating in the economy, then the amount of economic activity you can support will be drastically lower than it was. So in a period of deflationary depression, which is exactly where we're headed, we are going to find that they call it a liquidity crunch for this reason. There's no liquidity in the system. There's not a lot of money, and what there is not circulating. So the economy has a seizure. If you have a local currency is only money within the trust horizon that it exists within. So it isn't money somewhere else. It isn't money 50 kilometers down the road. It can only be used as money in the area in which it functions. And so it's captive demand because it means that the people within that area have the capacity to pay for something that they happen to want. And if you have captive demand, you can end up building local supply because you have the money in circulation to support it. So the money must circulate in that local area. There's nowhere else it can circulate because it is a local area. Money can still circulate, and that will support economic activity in that local area. So these things are going to be extremely important going forward. When there's not enough of the main formal currency, there are going to have to be other ways people having something that each other wants. But it may be that what you really have is 10 people who you need to exchange things with, not just two. And it all becomes extremely inefficient. How do you value one thing against? So that's what money is one of the functions of money. You've got a measure of value so that you can make barter much more efficient than it otherwise would be. And I think that function absolutely is going to have to still be met one way or another.
One of the ideas that Tom Greco had when I talked with him a couple weeks ago was that certain stores, like in Michigan, there's a very large grocery store chain that also sells pretty much everything else. It sells clothing and hardware and books and electronics and toys and everything. It's a very, very large store. It's called Meijer. And that Meijer could, as far as the employees are concerned, could legally pay the employees, all of the employees, minimum wage for Michigan, but then it could also pay more using like Meijer dollars, Meijer credit or something, which would be denominated in the same amount, and they could either be coupons or they could just be a credit on the account of the store, but then that would be a way to create and especially if it was made into a printed currency, that would be a way to, that a business could create a community currency, and the promise, of course, would be that they had to redeem it the same as cash when purchasing something from the Meijer store. So this is the Wikipedia page on the Cashless Society, and if you look, it says Cashless Society at the top. Advantages of cashless society: reduced business risks and costs, so businesses like it. They don't have to have cash on hand. Reducing transmittal of disease, that was, I think, recently added. Transaction speed, of course, the business gets the money a lot faster. Elimination of high denomination notes for the purpose of reducing criminal activity. In some countries, apparently the size of the note is $20 or less. So I don't know if $10, but the notes are getting smaller in some countries. Better collection of economic data. Of course, that would be interesting to businesses. Easier consumer budgeting. And the concerns, like Nicole was saying, lack of privacy, problems for the unbanked, which we had not yet talked about, digital fraud, centralized control, which again, Nicole had mentioned, overspending, which we have not touched on, and the criticism in Sweden. You wrote this whole paper on cashless society. What other points did you make in your paper?
Well, I mean, basically, we're being pushed in that direction in order that there would be a lot more control over the money supply than we currently have. And one of the main reasons for doing that is it's not just to control everybody's money. It's to try and protect the banking system from bank runs. So right now, governments and central banks are trying to encourage people to spend, to stave off deflation. In order to do this, they've tried to cut interest rates as much as they possibly could to try and encourage people to borrow money, to say, see, money is cheap, you can borrow money from us, and now is a great time to invest. And if you do that, it keeps the credit Ponzi scheme going. But there comes a point where even zero isn't low enough, that you don't have willing borrowers and lenders even at zero. And in fact, zero is the nominal interest rate. That's not the real interest rate, and it's the real interest rate that matters. So during normal times, the real interest rate is going to be the nominal rate minus inflation. So if the nominal rate was 5% and inflation is 2%, then the real interest rate is 3%. So in deflationary times, that equation becomes the real rate is the nominal rate minus negative inflation. And when you try to subtract a negative, those numbers are now added. So if you had 5% interest rates and the real interest rate was -2, then now you've got a real interest rate of 7%. So the problem is when you're in contractionary times, the real interest rates are high, even if the nominal interest rate is low. So you end up with a situation where you think that you've cut interest rates far enough to make money look attractive, but in practice, the real interest rate is still going to be too high. And that gets worse no matter how you go through this contractionary time, no matter how much you cut interest rates, you can't get interest rates down to a point where the real interest rate ends up looking attractive. So you're pushing on a piece of string. Piece of string is something where if you exert a pull force on a piece of string, you can achieve something. If you push on a piece of string, nothing will happen. And it doesn't matter if you push on it harder and harder and harder, still nothing is going to happen. That's the liquidity trap. And that's pretty much where we're going to be. They want to cut interest rates into the negative because zero hasn't been low enough. They want it to go lower than that. But even with negative interest rates, it's not likely to be enough to make borrowing and lending attractive. And it will mean that people would be likely to take their money out of the bank. Because normally, if you put your money in the bank, you would expect to earn a certain amount of interest on that. So you put it there, and you get paid for the privilege of them using it. But with negative interest rates, if you put your money in the bank, you will watch it lose value every month. Whereas if you simply kept it at home, it wouldn't lose value. So what are people going to do? People are going to go and take their money out of the bank. And because banks hold less than 1% of the money supply, less than 1% of the deposit base that people think is in there, as soon as people start taking money out of the bank, you have a bank run. So if you have negative interest rates, the obvious thing for people to do is take their money out of the bank. So then you have to find ways to not let them do that. And if you have only electronic banking systems, you can say, okay, people are only able to take out a certain amount of money per week or per month. You have control over what people can do with the money in the banking system if it's purely electronic. You don't have that control necessarily if you have a traditional kind of system. So they want to be able to go cashless in order that they can get rid of the zero lower bound. So zero is the lowest level you can have where you do not create an incentive for people to take money out of the bank. So in order to get around that zero lower bound, you move in the direction of a cashless society. And that's exactly what's happening. But it's really going to be giving huge amounts of control to the central banking system at a time when I think that's not a good idea.
So one of my checking accounts is, as long as we make a certain number of transactions, whatever our balance is in there each month, we get a 3% interest on. But if there's actually a deflationary situation for most prices, then our real interest rate is better than 3%. But then some people are going to say, one of my friends on Facebook, for example, said, well, why don't you just put your money in the stock market? The stocks, I mean, they went down in March, but they're back up again.
Well, they're back up again for the time being. I don't think this is going to last for long. And I think the only reason that they're back up is because there was this absolutely huge bailout system for all these larger players. But this is just creating zombie companies. These are not companies that have any future. I mean, if you're a cruise line, you may get bailed out now, but if you can't convince customers to come back, or if customers haven't got the money to come back anyway, even if they wanted to, then you're still going to go out of business at some point. So this has not maintained value, created value in any way. This has just been a huge bailout of the larger players at the expense of everybody at the bottom of the pyramid. So this has not been a good thing at all. And at some point, the reckoning will be there. They might be making new highs, but it's still only a very, very temporary thing. And we're not looking at any kind of economic recovery anytime soon. Main Street is being absolutely gutted. So small businesses are going to be declaring bankruptcy in droves, so are individuals. And at that point, the larger players who've been bailed out just have a one-off bailout, but no means to maintain themselves in the future. It's a kind of, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach him to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. This is about just giving a one-off thing, but without any way to secure the future, without any path to true economic recovery for these companies. So it's just a clear waste of money. It's just creating even more excess claims to underlying real wealth when you already have more than 100 times as many claims as there is underlying real wealth. Just creating even more of those claims in the hands of the larger players means that the smaller players are going to be dispossessed to an even greater extent at some point down the line.
Well, let's finish up on this topic and then go to what's going on right now and anything that you've noticed over the last week. So do you have other thoughts on, I mean, it sounds like you're pretty firmly reluctant to advise anyone to support a cashless society, and that there are many issues with it. And maybe this is something that's better. Let's just let Sweden finish what they're doing with their experiment. And then if that works really, really well, then maybe we'll talk. But, you know, let somebody else do it first, not us.
Yeah, it's worked better in Sweden than it would in most places because Sweden is a high trust environment. People do trust their government, so they don't think of it as risky to put everything into electronic systems. That simply isn't the case in a lot of places. Sweden has had good governance for a long time, so people trust that that will continue. I personally think it won't, but nevertheless, I can see why they have that level of trust. I just think that it's going to prove to be misplaced at some point. And trying to give that level of trust to governments that are much less trustworthy than the Swedish one is even more of a non-starter, I think. I mean, it really does punish the people at the bottom enormously, and not just the people at the very, very bottom, but I think it's going to be a way of dispossessing the middle class, possibly in a hurry, as happened in Argentina. People in the middle class lost everything very, very quickly in 2001. And that value, the ownership of that value went straight up to the top of the financial pyramid. And it's very much what I would think would happen again under circumstances like this. I think trying to move to a cashless society is a huge trap.
This is interesting that you mentioned Argentina, because one of the 3 videos I watched with Michael Hudson today, he was also mentioning Argentina and how something had happened there with the owners, the rentier class, whatever, however he said it, to the oligarchs, the owner, just the owners. I think the owners, the bosses, you know, the people that got the money, the people that got the capital. Can you just maybe summarize that to refresh me and anybody else who isn't familiar?
So the original Argentina crash in 2001, or the one that they're on the verge of having now?
Well, both, sure.
They are going to go through this again. So there was a dollar peg in Argentina between their currency and the US dollar. And basically because everyone could see that Argentina was moving towards problems, there was more and more pressure on that peg, because there was more and more, it was more obvious that their currency was not going to be worth as much as the US dollar. And so at some point, what they did is they closed the banking system, they dropped the dollar peg, but because at that point people couldn't get their money out, the banks were closed, people weren't able to then go and take all their money out, the dollar peg was gone, then the value of their savings in dollars fell abruptly by about 50%. Their debts were still there, still as large as they ever were. Often the savings were in their own currency. The debts were dollar denominated. So when the value of the savings fell, the value of the debts did not. So it heavily favored the creditors. Now whatever you had in savings,
so this would have affected
the debt.
This would have affected wages as well then, because the wages would still be denominated in Argentinian peso, was it maybe?
Yep. So you would end up with basically a 50% wage cut, 50% less savings, and the same amount of debt that you had before. And then they imposed strict limits as to what you could withdraw from the bank. Then eventually you just couldn't get anything out. So they took everything that the middle class had. The middle class was dispossessed almost entirely and very, very quickly. And that, I think, is something that could definitely happen in this crisis as well. It's going to be extremely messy. So people are not going to put up with that and just take it lying down. It is definitely going to cause unrest.
It's interesting because again, Michael Hudson, he didn't suggest any particular action that people should take, but he did mention that he was feeling like people were getting to a point where they were not going to just stay at home anymore.
Yes, I think that they're not. Unfortunately, some people absolutely can't stay home. They have to go to work. They have to find some way to feed their family. So they will take whatever risks they have to take to do that. Other people just can't stand the social isolation. So we have one extrovert in this house, for instance, who had
Well,
a
I
really
think in this case, this was recorded in January, so I think he was referring to just not going to take this anymore, this what's going on with the economy.
Mhm. Well, yes, and that's very much the feeling that people are going to get as the market starts to slide again. If you notice, if you follow what happens with the market, the times when the market is tanking are exactly the times when people are saying things like, we're not going to take it anymore. And it's the actions they take because they feel that way that are what bring the market down. So when you look at what is happening at the moment, now things are going up again, you're hearing less of that. When we reach the next peak and it turns down again, you will hear more of that. So it would be really interesting to see what impact that has. I personally think it's going to have a lot of impact on the real economy and on politics. So this year could be incredibly volatile. And that's just going to add enormously to the uncertainty. The people have no idea which way things are going. It looks from one day to the other like one person might win, then the other person might win. And I just think there's going to be chaos at some point over the rest of this year because of the extent to which things are changing so rapidly.
Well, thank you so much, Nicole. And thank you for everybody for viewing. If you haven't liked and subscribed and hit notifications and made a comment and shared, please do so. And we will see you next time. Thanks.
Okay.